Welcome. Today we're going to do something a little bit different than usual by doing an introduction to a character, a work, and a universe altogether rather than going on a specific book. I decided to do that because this will save us time in future reviews, more or less, and will give people a starting point when reviewing or wanting to get into this particular set of works. Bob Morane is pretty much one of the biggest, if not the longest running French bande dessinée in a way, as well as pulp hero. It was created quite some time ago and has been influencing people ever since its first publication. We're going to go through it together. There's quite a few things we're going to look at, and we might do things in a bit of a different way than what we usually do. We're going to try to keep this a little bit interesting for everyone. Bob Morane was created by Henri Verne, who was a Belgian Renaissance man. I think that's the best way to characterize him. It started writing these books in 1953, and he died at the age of 102, and he was apparently still writing at that time, just for fun mostly, or to pass time. Henri Verne's personal history, once you start looking into it, is a reflection of the character he created. He was a globetrotter. He did all sorts of military action. He served in all sorts of organization, helped all sorts of people, held various positions before being a journalist and a comic book artist. This is a man that lived through a lot, which reflects what we see from early comic book artists in the US as well. Many of them having served in the military in World War II or World War I, even in some cases. And a very interesting man if you want to read about him. The work itself is 229 novels. Those are fairly short novels, or average, around 240 pages in pocketbook size. Not a massive 600 pager like we're used to now with a lot of those kinds of series, but they were easy to write, easy to publish as well. At some point during his peak, Henri Verne could easily write about one novel every 2 months, and the releases were steady. So it was a good revenue for him, a great revenue for Marabout Junior, and for various international publishers in German, in Spanish, in Portuguese, etc. So it was not restricted to Franco-Belgian regions as well. There's also a significant number of short stories, many of which are kind of lost to the ages now, as they were published in various magazines or various newspaper. So sometimes some of those short stories pop up and you're like, well, where did that come from? You look at the dates and you figure out that it was just a thing Verne wrote probably in between two of his novels on a trip somewhere, more than likely, and that which inspired what he was writing at the time. Of course, here we're a comic book channel, so we're not going to review the actual novels, but there's 85 graphic novel slash comic book of Bob Morane, which were adapted from the novels. So we're still far from the 229, but there's probably a few of those novels which could not be adapted into graphic novels, at least not easily. Some of them just are too esoteric or just not very good. I'm not going to say that all the Bob Morane novels are good either, but 85 graphic novels over about maybe 50 years, 60 years is still a massive amount as well, especially since we're talking here full size graphic novel, 42 to 47 pages, full size, rather than the smaller size comic books in the US are used to, or the even smaller manga format. And then were published, those graphic novels were published under various publishers over the years. More recently, in compilations and things like that, Trou le Lombard, who's basically Magazine Tintin on the side. So this has been a cornerstone of the Franco-Belgian graphic novel market for quite some times. Over the years, multiple artists went to do Bob Morane, and overall, there's 6 that are directly credited, and there's a modern reimagining of the character that's started recently that I haven't touched yet, so I can't give any details on. The style vary between artists, but it generally remains very realistic and serious It's far from the cartoony look that we have in a lot of Franco-Belgian comics, especially at the time. It's really trying for that serious pulp style, very close to the American comic in a way. First one I remember is the first one, Dino and Atanasio, and he worked on the first books. And I have to say, when we grabbed them from libraries, they were generally more or less antiques, rebinded 2 or 3 times in the racks, and you were not sure when you were picking them up if they were going to fall apart. Those were well read book in libraries, let's face it. Hopefully nowadays most of them are compiled in larger integral, where you got three, four, 5 stories in one book. Those are usually fairly nice, but you do have to be careful because some of them are too large. The binding starts tearing off. So I do like the integral for the pricing, sometimes between 30 some odd dollars to $50 for 6 stories. Sometimes it's a very good deal, but sometimes you do have to be careful about how the book is done. We might look into it more when we talk about the specific books as we review them. I have no memory of Gerald Thornton's time as an artist for Bob Morane. He did 14 books overall for the series. It's a style that was a little bit more modern from what I saw when I was looking for art styles and things on the internet, but I honestly do not remember those books at all. The first ones I do remember are the ones from William Vance, who is better known for his work on 13, which has been adapted as a TV series fairly recently, the last 10 years. And he's a fairly prolific artist for comic books. He did 18 books between 1969 and 1978, so close to 2 books a year at 47 pages per book. That's still a pretty good pace overall, especially since he was working on other things at the same time. And that's really where the popularity of the comic was at its peak or climbing to its peak. 60s and 70s in Europe are where the biggest comic books really began and really took flight. And this is the same with Bob Morane. The last well-known artist for Bob Morane was Coria, who's actually Vance's brother-in-law and an early assistant to him. He learned to draw with Vance and through male classes, but he did work with him quite a lot. So that's why the two have a very similar style. It's a striking resemblance. If you look at the two of the books, you might see that Coria is a little bit more modern with some of the art style and some of the techniques he used. But I can't say that Vance is an old school artist either. He was at the edge of the new age of comics in Europe. Different style, but very close, both of them. I've read True Things since his brother-in-law, and they kept a very good relationship throughout their lives. They're actually living close to each other now in their retirements, etc. Seems like a great little story to include in the life of the character. We're really looking at two-fisted pulp here. This is a man that's always going to be 33 years old, from the first novel in 1953 to the most recent books in the 2000s. He has adventures throughout the world, simple detective stories, spy thrillers, sci-fi epics, time travel, archaeology, you name it, Bob Moran's done it at some point in his 229 novel career. And through the 85 graphic novels, you're going to find something that was done by the hero. This is really reminiscent of those serials and those like Indiana Jones like stories in a way, as he is a man of the world that you can insert into any situation and leave the situation pretty much unchanged so you can just insert them again in a later one. Once you look into things, though, it's kind of funny to know that Bamaran, the first comics were to be included in pre-publication in Femme d'Aujourd'hui, which is a modern woman magazine from Belgium. One of the bigger ones, obviously, but that particular magazine was mainly for, how to make different clothes, what were the shopping tendencies and basic things for what they considered modern women, working women mostly. That particular book had a kids section in it, obviously, so that you got the magazine, the kids can at least take advantage of it a little bit. as well. But I can easily imagine that women were quite fond of reading adventures of rugged, adventurous men, especially fairly romantic ones, in their magazines. While it was not the original target, it is quite likely that it did affect things a little bit. There were a large number of adaptations of Bob Morane. There was an actual live action TV series. There was a movie that was done, which was lost in a fire. There was only one copy done, and the theater caught fire before it could be distributed. There were various disc adaptations, which were basically audio novels. There's a late 1990s cartoon series from which we have a picture here, which was very different from the original style, I would say, from Correa and William Vance, which is what turned me off from it mostly. It was not an awful TV series from the late 90s to the early 2000s, but it lacked something because it didn't look like it should. The style Vance and Correa have are iconic, so if you were to adapt it, that's the style that should have been used. The band Indochine made a song called L'Aventurier based on this character, and other characters were also introduced in various songs by that band. We can see that Bob Morane had a significant impact on French culture over the years. I had to look because it's something that always interests me. The current movie rights belong to Christian Larouche, a French Canadian since 2014. He had a lot of ideas and wanted to move things forward, but there has not been any real movements for either a movie or a TV series since then. I would probably blame COVID for part of it because it's easy to blame COVID for anything, but 2014, that was quite a bit before as well. Getting financing for a pulp, very masculine hero in this day and age, probably not the easiest thing to do, unfortunately. We're going to have a look at some of the main characters in this series so we don't have to repeat it over and over when we go into various books. To give a quick introduction to them in the various reviews we're going to do still, but we're going to try to go more into depth in here. Bob Morane is a 33-year-old military Air Force veteran. Originally from World War II, if you read through the lines, he served during the Battle of Britain, etc., during World War II. Currently, his day job is being a journalist, but obviously, that job exists in French comics to give a reason for the character to go around the world. So he's an all around adventurer, spy, archaeologist, detective, vigilante, secret agent, anything that he would need to be for the adventure at hand, he is. But the way to bring him to the adventure very often is to say, well, he's working on a story in San Francisco, he's working on a story on Easter Island. And this is what brings the characters together and moves the story forward. This is why Tintin is a journalist. That's why Spirou is a journalist. The list goes on. For those international style journalists, were great heroes back in the days. Nowadays, they're quite a bit different when we're talking about journalists, unfortunately. Like many pulp heroes, he's a Renaissance man. He loves art. He loves beautiful things. He loves eating well. He's knowledgeable in modern technology. He is actually credited as being an engineer and a polytechnician. He's basically able to drive, pilot, sail, anything he gets his hand on, including futuristic space shuttles to very basic planes, sailboats, little motorboats, larger boats, whatever you want, he's able to do. At least in the case of Bob Morane, you can say that he's got a military background and he's got military experience, as opposed to Tintin, who's able to do all of those things, but basically is a child journalist. Very different characters overall. At 33 years old, we can expect Bob to have a decent block of knowledge and experiences in his life. As a journalist and a world class adventurer, he knows tons of languages. He knows tons of things in general about cultures, where he's visiting, etc. A lot of it comes from Henri Verne himself, having been himself a globetrotter and a man who went on adventures in his youth around the world, hiding his own identity, etc. Bob does reflect that kind of international understanding While stereotypes are used in the stories quite often, obviously, there is always a sense of respect for other cultures in most places. Nothing's always black and white except for the villains in the stories when we're meeting with new people and new cultures. Bob himself has tons of contacts with the intelligence services around the world: Scotland Yard, MI6, CIA, RCMP. Wherever he goes, someone's bound to know who he is. And if necessary, well, they'll get in contact with him. The most common one being this: whenever Bob goes to the US, Herbert Gaines, a director at the CIA, has a tendency to get in contact with him and tell him, well, there's a bit of a catastrophe going on. Can you help? Bob is a bit of a lover of women and a Casanova, but the series and the stories never really act on it. It's always implied and underneath the whole actual story. Eh, and over the years and over the adventures, we see that he has very good relations with a fellow reporter from Britain, the niece of one of his mortal enemies, and the leader of an international crime syndicate. So we have a character that is all over the place in a way, but that people can easily identify with. Bob's best friend is a giant Scotsman called William Ballantyne. Bill is about 2 meters tall. He's got the strength of a bull. He's got fists the size of a kid's head. He's the mix of comedic relief and brute power that you often have in those Franco-Belgian comics. He's far more approachable than Bob, which seems to be a bit more reserved at times. He generally drinks, he smokes, he eats well, he laughs a lot, he sings, he whistles. He is the man that you want to get in contact with in order to get in contact with Bob, who will solve your problems. Bill is a bit superstitious and does drink quite a bit of whiskey. Very reminiscent, once again, of Capitaine Haddock, if you think at it this way, in early comic book history. This is a typical dichotomy of Franco-Belgian comics and novels at the time, especially because there was a time where you could not have a women character included in those types of stories, or at least not directly. Bill and Bob are always together, more or less. There's a few adventures that Bob is alone at, or he has other allies in. But Bill is fairly omnipresent. I would say that at least 3/4 of the stories that I remember, he shows up in. One of the funny things about him as well, he always refers to Bob as Commander, even though Bob is no longer in the military. So we have that bit of a joke going on at the same time. Personally, I think Bill is my favorite character in this particular series. Bob is very identifiable and relatable to, but Bill is a bon vivant, which is, I think I prefer as a character generally. Bob's main bad guy, in a way, he's the one that's the most commonly introduced. There's a few others that come and go, but the most well known and the most identifiable would be Monsieur Ming, L'Ombre Jaune, who's an undetermined Asian. We're not sure if he's Chinese, Mongol, Tibetan. They keep changing his origin through the story and the dialogue. We are never quite sure where he's from. That's part of the mystery of the character. And he controlled the international crime organization Shintan, who's mainly composed of mercenaries and assassins, a lot of them from India, either Thuggees, dacoit, assassins. And himself is an evil genius and a mastermind. A lot of his plans are to either take over countries or take over the underground in a country so he has more powers. So he is a rather nefarious individual, completely immoral. He doesn't care how many people get killed or what cities get destroyed by his machinations. The way he's represented is a 2 meter tall man, once again, strongly built, but it's all hidden under a black clergyman outfit, which contrasts with his Asian origin. People can't tell where he's from, not only by his features and the way he acts, but also because he speaks just about any language absolutely perfectly. Ming's most powerful asset, however, is the fact that he is pretty much immortal. Whenever he is killed, a machine called the duplicator basically creates a clone of him with all of his memories and all of his knowledge from the moment of his untimely death. So you're going to have Bob kill him in numerous adventures, him falling off cliffs, exploding in a plane, all sorts of things along those lines, obviously. But he always comes back. Originally, of course, he was killed in one of the first stories, and Verne wanted to bring him back, and he didn't know how. Invented that method, and things got progressively worse. That's why sometimes thinking before you write is not a bad idea. But then again, you have to think that the guy was literally writing a novel every 2 months for a while. It must get pretty difficult. It does sound a lot like Rachel Ghoul. Once you look into it, once you dig into it, you're like, well, it does look quite a bit the same. L'Ombre Jaune dates from 1959. Rachel Ghoul's first appearance is 1971. I have no doubt that people in America would know about novels and comics from that particular era in Europe. I'm pretty sure there was a clear inspiration that was taken from it, but it could also be a completely weird coincidence. Of course, both characters are in a way inspired from Fu Manchu, who was an even older character. So we could get into the weeds, start to dig up anything we can. I am trying to dig up to see if there is an actual connection between early Bob Morane and Rachel Ghoul. I have no idea if I'll be able to find anything that's a long-term project, more than likely. Other characters that are in stories quite often, we've got the Aristide Clérambard, who's the necessary scientist friend of our heroes. You have that with Professor Tournesol in Tintin, Champignac in Spirou. You will notice if you go in those type of pulp heroes in European comics, those kind of characters always come up. Unlike Tournesol, who's a physicist, and Champignac, who is a mycologist, Clérambard is an archaeologist, historian slash inventor. Mainly archaeologist and historian. A lot of the stories where we see him participate in is when Bob goes on a archaeological dig somewhere, or Clérambard calls him and like, I found something incredible on Easter Island. Can you come and help? And then they find an underground city, and then there's evil, degenerate men there that try to eat them. And, it's the typical pulp stories from that point on. Yes, he looks like Colonel Sanders. His age is undetermined. It changes from book to book. So if you look, Bob's always 33, Bill's always 34, and Clérambard goes from being 60 to 72. And there's a line in one of the books where it's, well, I think it's actually in one of the comics as well, where Bill says, like, well, we've just celebrated your 60th birthday for a fifth year in a row. There's a bit of a recurring joke in the back there, probably something the editors couldn't catch at first, and then Verne made fun of it through time. He generally helps our heroes. He is old, but he's still skilled in Aikido and Jiu-Jitsu. He knows how to fight with a sword. He is a very capable old man compared to, let's say, Tournesol in Tintin. But often enough, he also gets kidnapped, threatened, blackmailed, all sorts of things so the story can move forward. And so Bob can go on an adventure to rescue his friend. So we have another interesting character. He was more frequently included in the early stories in bande dessinée and comics, while the later books a lot less. So if you start reading from the first comics by Di Anastasio, you will be like, okay, well, Clérambard is a recurring character. Then when you get to Vance's and Correa's work, you'll be like, well, where is he? Because he is not there anywhere close as much. Another fun character that is included quite a bit is the beautiful journalist Sophia Paramount, who's a British journalist from the paper The Chronicle. She's a model-like redhead who teams up with Bob on various adventures. Once again, she is also extremely competent in all sorts of things. She's not just a damsel in distress to be rescued, even though it does happen every once in a while. That's what happens to her. But she's often there to help with all sorts of things. and that the help she gives is often more than just an intellectual. She is able to use her charms to go through guards. She's able to use her wit to realize what a puzzle or an enigma is. She is not comparable to Bob in terms of adventurousness, but she is a key character. She rather fancies Bob, obviously, and you've got few lines in various novels and various comics as well, where it's very clear that she wouldn't mind being with him, and there might even be something going on between them. So, what are we in for? Well, Bob Morane is a massive literary work, even just on the comic side of things. I could easily have a channel dedicated to Bob Morane, and I'd still have content 10 years from now, especially if we start seeing movies of this coming out. Who knows if that'll happen, but it's always a possibility. It's a significant and fun work, and it's easy to get material from compared to some of the other older French series sometimes. And it's easy enough to do something with. Will I do one a month, two a month? It'll probably depend on what comes in as far as comics goes, or if there's something really interesting that I've just read that I want to talk about. If crowdfunded books just wash in and I have to give my opinion on them, there's quite a few things that can happen, but it could easily be something I do at least once a month. By making this particular video separately, we're going to be able to go into the series easily at any time. And if anybody wants to get all the details, they can just jump on this presentation rather than have to go through this whole setup of every presentation. Also gives me a starting point for various discussions that I might want to have in regards to modern comics versus those pulp serials. I believe personally that pulp serials like these are a better mean of storytelling than the sequential storytelling we see in modern American comic. That's a big discussion. That'd be a lot of work if we wanted to go into that. I would love to have people ask a question about this or have people start a discussion about this. And it's not something that can easily be done on simple forums like Twitter or Facebook. This would need something a little bit more structured. Now that we're done with this, I thank you very much for listening to me today. I hope you guys have a very nice rest of your day. Keep on reading comics, keep on enjoying them. I'll keep analyzing them, and we'll see you guys later. Bye bye.